Yes.
Okay. Tasha, let us know when we can start. Okay, I guess Tasha's audio is having trouble, so we'll go ahead and get started because I see the recording thing here. So one of the action items from past meetings was to kind of start prototyping a tenant resource, a custom resource, and some ideas had been thrown around in the team. So Yisui has been driving prototyping of a custom resource. I've supported a little bit, but this is mostly work done by Yisui. So Yisui, you're going to give us an update, and then we'll open it up to the team on questions.
Yes. Let me share the screen. So according to last meeting, we have presented this tenancy CRD proposal. I'm not going to going through this again. So this time I'm going to show a demo, which we built a tenant controller. It watches the tenant CRD and creates namespace and set up RBAC for the tenant users. And according to this proposal, we also introduced a namespace template. So when a tenant user want to create, tenant admin want to create tenant, and they can choose a namespace template, which defines a few predefined policy objects to be populated into the namespace. And I list a few questions when I implement this prototype, and I think we can have a discussion when the demo is over. So let me switch to demo. First, I have created a cluster, and I have installed the tenant controller on the cluster. So let's first take a look at a tenant CRD as shown as a very simple Kubernetes resource called tenant. Specify a name, and it specify a list of tenant admins, and it want a namespace called ns-1. So today in current implementation, we will create a final namespace with a tenant name as a prefix. And probably that's not good design, and we can change that later. But in this demo, you will see the namespace are prefixed with tenant name.
And Yisui, let's just lay out some assumptions beforehand. The general model here is that one tenant contains multiple namespaces, and there is a common set of admins for that tenant, and they have common set of access privileges across those namespaces within the tenant.
Yeah, so let's start from a very simple user flow. So basically a tenant admin creates a tenant CRD, and it gets the namespace created. So first, let's see how many namespaces are already created. So today, there's no additional namespace created. All these three are built-in namespaces. And let's try to create this tenant CRD. And this tenancy I created, we can check that tenant 1. This is exactly the same content in spec as that described in the YAML file, and probably the namespace is already created. Give me a second. Let me check if the Oh, I think I forgot to install this tenant controller. Yeah, let's check if namespace created. Okay, now we get the tenant one, namespace one. We can take a look what's inside. It's basically very minimum. It has a RBAC. It has a very minimum row bindings created inside. So basically, it binds the T1 admin to the admin cluster role, which is a namespace admin who has full privilege inside the namespace. And when the tenant object is created, there's additional cluster role binding created to grant the tenant admin the update and delete permission on the tenant object itself. So if we check the cluster role binding, it gets automatically created tenant's namespace admin. Oh, it's a tenant admins tenant one. This binds to a row called tenant admin, a cluster row called tenant admin tenant one. So we can check this. It grants additional privilege to get updated, patch, and delete the specific tenant object. So with that, other tenant admins will not be able to like delete or change anything which they don't own. And next step, if the tenant admin want to add a new namespace, let's see, they probably want to change the tenant object by adding a new namespace called ns-2. And at the same time, they want to apply the namespace template called restricted. Let's take a look at the namespace template. It's a very simple object. It defines a list of policy objects. So in this restrict namespace template, it has a role bindings to all the service count in the namespace to use the restricted security policy. And it also defines a network policy. By default, it will block all the ingress and egress and traffic between the namespace and other namespaces. So if we update this tenant object, so it will have tenant one namespace 2 created, and inside we can see it will have row bindings. Row let me check network policy. Oh, probably the RBAC, something wrong with RBAC, which doesn't grant the controller with access to the namespace template. Yeah, the namespace template are not listed. Okay. Let me restart this tenant controller. Okay, so it gets the network policy created in the namespace, and the default role bindings gets created in this new namespace. So we have two namespaces for the tenant. And similarly, if the tenant element moves on to change the tenant object, like remove a namespace from the list or change the namespace template, the corresponding reaction will also be performed on the namespace by the tenant controller. So this is the demo. And let's go back to some questions we met during this building this prototype. So the first is about the namespace name. So how do we determine the namespace name? There's a few opinions about if the actual namespace name should be specified in a tenant object, or we prefix the namespace with name with the tenant name. So this is a question needed to be discussed. And the second is more complicated when changes happen to the tenant object or the namespace template. So if the namespace template is updated after tenant is created, what will happen? A simplest model is basically we do nothing. So the change of namespace template will affect the newly created namespaces, but not the existing ones. And this approach so makes it difficult to like update the policy in existing namespaces. And And we also need a mechanism to figure out if the namespace has already been populated in the case of the restart of the controller. And the second, basically, we can watch the namespace template and update all namespace immediately, including both the newly created ones and existing ones. And that will probably introduce unexpected breakage because like some policy change will affect the existing workloads. And combine the both solutions, we can probably use a special label on the policy objects defined in the namespace template, something like a reconcile equal to true. When the namespace template changed, we'll only update existing namespaces for the policy objects with reconcile equal to true label. That provides the cluster admin a more fine-grained control and to define which policies should be always enforced. And another question about if the tenant object is being updated. For example, there's a very dangerous operation. If you accidentally update a tenant object by removing a namespace from list, which is unintentional, and the control moves forward to delete the namespace, which will probably cause very expensive cost to recover the objects already being created in the namespace. And how we can manage that in a better way. So probably there will be more questions regarding this approach and tenancy RD, and we'd like to hear more feedback from people. So that's all for demo.
Any question? Well, first off, this is awesome, and this is exactly what I was hoping to see. For discussing the updates to namespaces in general, what about the other way around? Do we or should we care about somebody changing the parameters of a namespace that is under a tenant, and worrying about breaking changes if we override it? If we take options B or C, we might override or have to somehow merge changes from that perspective. And if not, if we want to lock down the namespace to not let anyone change its permissions outside of a tenant permission, how could we reconcile that other than, watch the tenant for any changes and then immediately revert them back? Have you given any thought to that, or kind of what you're thinking on that?
Actually, I have thought a little about that. Usually, watching individual policy objects inside namespace according to the namespace template will be actually difficult and quite expensive, and that causes the control logic become very complicated. Another alternative way is we can probably introduce a admission controller for any creation or update, whatever delete operation happened in the namespace. We can compare the policy object to the namespace template and prevent accidental update in the policy objects inside of the admission controller. And probably that will be much simpler compared to setting up complicated RBAC rules.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, so with the controller, would the thought then we would try to merge the changes with existing tenant templates, or we would reject anything that doesn't exist in the tenant template?
A very simplest way is probably rejecting any updates to the policy objects defined in the template, because merge is really complicated. Right. And you do require a lot of knowledge for individual resource type, and the way how we merge that will be completely different.
Right. Yeah. So that's what I was hoping to hear. I agree with that 100%.
Couple things. One possibility is to have an annotation on the namespace that's some kind of lock that says don't delete this thing when it gets removed from the tenant object. Might allow an extra safety net there. The other thing is right now on my clusters, I'm using basically a Helm chart for namespace for my tenants. One of the things it's doing is it actually creates 2 namespaces per tenant, one that the user has direct access to, and it launches a tiller there for them so that they don't have to Helm init something. And then it also creates an administrative namespace along the side where I load in my own privileged things like an Nginx ingress controller, Prometheus, and other things that are pointed only at that particular tenant's namespace. So one tenant can't really affect a controller that really wasn't designed to be multi-tenant. So it looks very, the tenant controller stuff looks really cool. It also looks like it would augment what I've been doing really nicely if we could like plumb up one of the tenant templates to be able to launch a Helm chart instead of just raw Kubernetes objects. That also gives the ability to easily upgrade as an operator the namespaces chart. So after they've already launched a namespace, I can go upgrade the tiller and the Nginx ingress and whatever else by just doing a Helm upgrade on that namespace chart.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. Yeah, that's interesting. If we can have an alternative way to bring in policy objects into namespaces, and I haven't think about carefully how we can define that in the namespace template, but I think that's a very good point.
So I mean, it's kind of hard, right, to create a namespace within a Helm chart anyway, just because of collisions, and if it already exists, it always generally has issues.
Yeah, the namespace itself, you still might need a template outside of Helm for, but there's a lot of other like services that you might actually want to provide as an operator for the tenants themselves, and you don't necessarily want to give them all the permissions necessary to set those things up themselves. But Helm makes it really easy to manage the life cycle of those things. So being able to plumb the two together would be super useful.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Hey guys, I'm wondering, could we maybe flip things around instead of trying to auto upgrade a namespace after we've changed the template, you just attach a namespace version to a namespace template version to each namespace. Then when you change the namespace template, you can see which namespaces aren't at the current version. And you could add a couple more verbs, like listed namespaces that aren't at the current version, and then maybe explicit upgrade. So then you don't have automatic upgrades, but you can sit there and say either force an explicit upgrade on a particular namespace or on all of them, and kind of leave it up to the user.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's actually interesting. I have think about that approach. It's something like a little similar to like version control. So a few things I'm still unclear about that is probably we will have like multiple namespace templates if we want to preserve the content of previous version. And it's less straightforward for the users. Like I just want to, for admin side, I just want to update this namespace template. The user experience becomes, the admin will have to explicitly figure out, I'm rolling out a new namespace template version instead of like update an existing one. Probably that's good. Yeah, but definitely that's a very good, interesting approach. And alternatively, I have think about if we can like copy over the namespace template content and put that in the status of the CRD of like a tenant CRD to present which template is being used for this namespace. And even the namespace template itself gets changed, we can still find out the old version of the content. but I haven't think through carefully with a very solid proposal. So yeah, that's definitely a very good suggestion.
Yeah, I was gonna just basically say the same thing, and I just want, I guess, to add to that is, I mean, pretty much every other Kubernetes resource doesn't have, an idea of the historical state of what, of what it was previously. It's just like, it's an apply, you overwrite what was there. So I don't know if that's really something we should be tackling as this part of this. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's becomes another question we have to solve.
I guess we wouldn't necessarily need the version if we just have like current versus not current, right? So then you have like the current template version, and then you just have this namespace is not at the current template version. So.
Well, we do have a challenge if some of the policy objects getting removed in the new version of the namespace template. So we should be clear if the user experience will be like when we refresh the policy objects in the namespace, shall we purge the out-of-date policy objects, or we just put in new policy objects, which may cause conflict with the, or which may have the side effect of the leftover policy objects.
Yeah, I almost wonder if it's easier to just make it an easy process to just spin up a second tenant and migrate your things over, and make the communication, the network policies between two tenants easy enough so that you can make it transparent to the actual underlying services. So then you can have two tenants with two different templates, but they kind of act as one. And then we need template or tenants of tenants then, right? But one step at a time.
Yeah, that's another approach. Actually, that's not necessary to have multiple tenants. They can have one tenant, but they have multiple namespaces. We can eventually migrate from one namespace to the other.
Yeah, that actually is an interesting concept of removing a namespace from one tenant and migrating it to another. I guess what would that take with the current implementation?
I mean, cross tenants, right?
Right. Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to be clear, right now you can do that even within the tenant. You could create a new namespace with a new template, and you could just have a way of migrating from that old namespace to the new namespace within the same tenant.
Right. But so the namespaces are created with the tenant ID as part of the namespace, right? So could we basically, so the namespace that was created was tenant -1 namespace or whatever, tenant A-NS1. Could we take that tenant A-NS1 and migrate it to a new tenant, and have both of those tenants reconcile and one not think it was deleted accidentally and try to recreate it, etc.? I don't know. Is that clear, the question? It sounds confusing in my head.
So one thing is, firstly, feel free to open issues on GitHub and describe your suggestions there, right? You can open issues, or you can write comments on this doc in Google Docs. And the POC code is in GitHub, so you can open comments over there. I think a lot of these questions have to do with modification of namespace attributes after creation, which may be a additional level of problem that we can defer for now, perhaps. Going back to some of the basic questions which you listed earlier. Firstly, the naming, right? Is there a consensus that we should basically let the creator of the tenant pick unique namespaces to begin with, and we don't do the concatenation? Or do we feel like we need to do some kind of, what is the working group's feeling about making the names unique within the controller versus letting the creator of the tenant have the responsibility of picking unique namespaces?
If I may, I would argue. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
I would argue that creating unique namespace names apart from the tenant populace, the tenant admin, whatever, is the vital functionality that the tenant controller can provide. At first, I was a bit nervous about the ability of the tenant admin to create new namespaces, but with a name prefixing, that's fine. It'll be unique as long as the tenant names are unique, which is assured by Kubernetes. So I think that's the best middle ground.
So one
I
issue.
really want to echo that. I really want to echo that it would really help if the if the tenancy controller was or if the namespaces had the name of the tenant prefixed, and then to avoid it's an odd thing, but to avoid a security hole, you'd also need to make sure that no one could create a namespace that had a tenant's prefix without being that tenant.
Right. Well, the one thing to think about with that is, in some cases, one would imagine that people who've been writing their applications across multiple namespaces have actually encoded the namespace names into their application manifests. So they wouldn't be able to run in an environment where we have actually modified the namespace names by prefixing the tenant name into it. So,
but setting the namespaces in a more dynamic way should be considered good style, I would assume, and having the developer force the namespace name is something that I would actively fight. It should be the last word should be with the cluster admin or somebody that has been deputied with that responsibility, like the tenant admin.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but there may be a fair amount of applications that have been rightly or wrongly written to hardcode the namespace name.
I think, we haven't had a multi-tenant Kubernetes before. So yes, there's software that was written to not function properly in that world so far. But we don't necessarily have to hamstring ourselves by saying that we have to support everything that exists before we came up with a solution.
Yeah. So one other possibility is, again, just like Yisui mentioned about the reconcile being optional, we could have the namespace embedding also be optional, meaning that when you're creating in tenant, you could either say, allow prepending or whatever, make namespace unique, whatever, or essentially a flag during the tenant creation, or just use the namespaces that the tenant creator provided without doing any changes, in which case the namespace tenant creator has already ensured the namespaces are unique. So we could actually support both options if we thought appropriate. Keep in mind, it's not just applications written poorly. The concept of a namespace is sitting inside the tenant, right? So the application developer can think of it as a construct that he can, he has some visibility on. And while somebody might argue that a correctly written application should never be encoding the namespace name or a correctly written application manifest, it might be a subjective opinion. Some people might feel like so.
But that raises two semantic questions, I think. One is what happens if multiple tenants or some non-tenant namespace and tenant namespace share the same name?
Yeah,
do they both get the access to that, or does that break something?
I also have a similar question there. Like, what is the sort of a root of trust or kind of a authority of managing the namespace versus managing the tenant, and how we kind of keep them connected? Maybe I missed that in the beginning, so pardon me if that's the case.
We part of it could be just a recommended best practice where you shouldn't be running this multi-tenancy controller in a controller where in a cluster where you also allow other people to create their own namespaces willy-nilly, because those would clash with the namespaces created through this controller. That could be one option. Second option is to just leave it to be their responsibility to ensure non-overlapping namespace names.
Can we have a global namespace, for example, like by having a tenant namespace or tenant / or colon? On top of that, if there's no names, if there's a namespace, their namespace is not belong to any tenant, we default put into this or default or global namespace to kind of at least, distinguish. I'm not sure how important it is, but just to be safe, I'm curious how people think about any alternatives.
Yeah, and if you have a global namespace, then you can't have the same name inside the tenant. For instance, Cube System or Ingress Controller or whatever.
Yeah, I think that the tenant namespace is kind of have to be unique anyway. I mean, if we could lock down the security of not allowing other tenants to add or create namespaces under that, then the network policies, you could use the tenant IDs to handle network policies, and if the tenant ID is within the namespace, then that means all of the services, their DNS entries will have the tenant ID with it, which I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
I think that's a good thing, because we've built where I worked before. We built a multi-tenanted cluster, and we had the case of automatically deleting Cube System because we messed up the configuration. If the tenant name is always prepended, then that case is simply avoided, so we don't nuke the cluster.
Can I make a suggestion? Could we just have tenant membership be decided by a signature on the namespaces themselves, whether it's in an annotation or wherever? That way, like, a tenant could select over a set of namespaces and then check to see if they have a valid signature.
Can you be more specific about the signature?
Like a cryptographic hash, I don't know. You just have a set of private keys that the tenant controller knows about, that are authorized to create, that are associated with tenants. And then any namespaces that have like an annotation that has been, contains the content of the namespace that's signed or something, right? With that private key, you can validate.
Could you add a comment on the doc and describe this? Because there's a lot of good thoughts here, but we may not be getting the whole context. You could.
Sure. Sorry. Jump into the conversation in non-time.
So that's kind of one thread here, which is just this namespace conflicts and resolution and so on. The second thread is this modification of templates after the tenant is created. The third point is, one of the key aspects of the way the RBAC has been designed for this controller is that when you're creating a tenant, I'm getting an echo here. So when you create a tenant, you explicitly provide a list of RBAC subjects that now own that tenant. And so they are the only ones that get access to updating or deleting that named resource called that specific tenant and those specific namespaces. Is everybody okay with that? Any issues? Meaning providing the list of owners during the tenant creation and then giving those specific owners access using named RBAC resources.
I think that's fine initially. So I was puzzling over the having the list of namespaces in the tenant and the issues that can cause with, editing the document and dropping one. Maybe the solution is to have a separate object, have a tenant namespace object, which is a request by a tenant for a namespace. And then that document triggers the actual namespace creation. And then you're decoupled from editing a single document every time you want a new object, a new namespace. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we need to think about these things.
Yeah.
Can't really say off the top of my head right now.
I mean, to me, it makes sense, but I mean, realistically, I don't know if it's going to solve that much of an issue because people are just going to automate all of that anyway and then accidentally delete one. So,
well, I'm thinking more, and because it's more in line with the rest of the Kubernetes API. Maybe you have a Helm chart or something that you throw a tenant namespace object in. You can't necessarily automate that kind of edit if it's in a single document. To talk to those applications that need multiple tenants or multiple namespaces at once, if you could have a tenant namespace object, then your deployment of your application can actually ask itself for the number of namespaces that it needs. Anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, keep adding those comments. Some of these we need to think through.
Can you repost the link to the document?
It's in the chat. Yangwan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Other comments or thoughts? One other thing to keep in mind here is that the namespace template contents are essentially completely open, meaning a namespace template is whatever series of policies you want to put in there, right? We have talked about documenting a curated set of namespace templates, but that would just be sample references. So really a namespace template can be anything. Somebody could choose a namespace template based on using pod security policies. Somebody else could choose a similar namespace template, but implemented using open policy agent. So the actual definition of standardized namespace templates is not something we're planning on doing. Is that okay with the working group, or how much of an opinionated reference do you think should be provided?
Yeah, additional thoughts on the schema of namespace template. We try to make it open because it's possible to support any CRDs which can be introduced by other controllers. If we make the schema too specific, we are basically limited to a scope of a list of well-known objects.
Right. Though I guess the remaining question is, should we even document some reference templates, or not even that? Because the work around documenting some profiles is essentially that. It is essentially documenting reference templates, but just as examples, not as anything mandated.
I mean, I think it'd be just helpful, I assume, if we have the demo that was given today, just all those files and kind of up in the GitHub repo. That's I think more than sufficient for us to develop the actual documentation around it on the other tasks.
Yeah.
my thinking is documented references. You know, a reference or examples is always really helpful, because sorry, I always speak entirely from a security perspective, but I think reference or examples are really, really helpful, especially because without them, people will use whatever they find on Stack Overflow. And as there, you know, a ton of people use whatever they find on Stack Overflow, and those examples can end up being bad. So I don't want to sign on to do that work, but yeah, I think it would be really helpful to have some good examples.
Yeah, so we've started some work on documenting soft profile, so feel free to contribute to it. Submit PRs, and then for the doc itself, so the one other thing comment is about process, right? So many of the working groups docs so far are actually in Google Docs, and we started one doc in the GitHub repo docs directory itself, but usually it's been a little less flexible to incorporate provide comments. So please provide comments on the docs, but eventually these go into GitHub as Markdown. But there's also an initial doc on a profile that I've started in the GitHub itself. Okay, Tasha, are you back on, or is your audio okay? Okay, we still can't hear you. Okay, any more thoughts before we close? David, any thoughts from your side?
One question, this is Kural from Intel. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. There's someone typing in the background. If somebody could mute themselves.
Okay, cool. So this is Kural from Intel. We are just following this POC work just for 2 weeks actually. So currently we are kind of interested on this POC. As one of the speakers before said, if there is, I'm planning just to put the documentation as a PR, just a reference documentation. What are the documents we have to refer? Because I was looking for the CRD spec, I couldn't able to find it. So I just put a PR to find where the documents, all these documents. And one more question is on the resource quota, right? So I was just skimming through the tenant CRDs. So yeah, tenant can be in multiple namespace. Or from the resource quota is per namespace, right? If you bringing the logic of tenant, is that we should create a controller which do the resource quota per tenant actually, because the tenant can be in multiple namespace, right?
Yeah, that's a very use case I have already heard about from a few customers. So when we use the tenant concept about namespaces, basically we need another level of control of resource quota across namespaces.
Exactly. Yeah.
And which can only be done in admission webhook with additional logic, which counts the total number of resources. And there's an even more complicated case where you have different requirements on how the tenant quota can be split into namespaces. And sometimes we can dynamically move some quota between namespaces when some namespaces is already exhausting the quota while others still have quota. So that will be a very interesting problem and require additional work in the admission webhook and also a separate CRD.
Okay, got you. Okay, cool.
So if you notice right now, the two CRDs are the tenant CRD itself and the namespace template CRD. There's also thought of having a tenant template CRD. and things like tenant level quotas could be attributes of a tenant template CRD.
Okay, cool. So is there a proposal in the document? There is any section on this one? Tenant template?
We briefly mentioned it, but we just wanted to phase it out. So just
Okay.
it's a question of phasing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
It's probably a catball on its own, but some way of doing quota across namespaces would be super useful.
Right. That's what the previous question was addressing. Yes.
Okay.
So again, just to take an analogy with alternative vendor products, they tend to have a project template and so on, and this would be the analogous of that, a tenant template.
But I'm talking also more like the raw quota objects that are namespaced today. If there was a way to have a tenant tenant quota that would allow multiple namespaces to share the same quota.
Well, as Yisui was mentioning, one thought there would be to have a separate admission controller which tracks the resource usage of different namespaces and then sums them up against the tenant level resource quota.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for the POC, we are converting the current POC code base to use the control runtime, and at that time it will be much easier to develop an admission webhook. Once that's ready, I think we can try out some ideas like this resource quota using admission control and maybe even some other CRDs doing together.
Okay, looks like we're at the top of the hour. So thanks everyone. Thanks for Yisui. Yisui did pretty much all the work here, and let's all thank him for doing a lot of work for the working group. So thank you.
Yeah,
Yisui.
thanks. It's looking really good.
It's really cool.